So I'm going to try this new little experiment where I read articles on here and talk about my thoughts about them, and we're going to see how it goes. And I've been inspired by a couple really bizarre workplace things that I've seen that maybe just rather selfishly I just want to rant about a little bit. But I want to start with the case for unbossing. I logged on to LinkedIn this morning, and this was literally one of the first things I saw on my top news and views. It had like 18,000 hits in 5 minutes, so obviously this is something LinkedIn is promoting. An editor wrote about it, and really it's about the CEO at this company, and I apologize, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that name. I would butcher it horribly, but he took his leadership team through an unbossed year-long training. And the reasoning behind this is, and it says right here in the blurb, that's because millennials seek collaborative servant leaders who put the team's success above their own, don't micromanage knowledge workers or tie them to outdated management hierarchies. One way to cut through the hierarchy: encourage employees to give 360-degree feedback about their leaders, but critics say the unbots movement can slow a company down due to its concession-based decision-making. There's so many problems with this blurb. There's so many issues that are already popping up into my head. And the very first thing I thought of was when Zappos decided that they wanted to go into this new management style, was new at the time, called the holacracy, which is basically they eliminated managers at Zappos. There are other components of holacracy as well. I'm not going to do a big long video about that, but this idea of is just eliminating managers, having people work in working groups, things like that. Now, this happened around 2014, and as you can see, I have a very old blog post that I wrote here. Don't ever go back and read anything I wrote that was like 5 years old. I was a bad writer back then, but I still have some of these posts up, and part of the reason I still have this up is I want some bragging rights on this one, okay? Because I predicted this was going to be a problem for Zappos when they did this, because the reality is that while there are absolutely people who respond to non-traditional management structures, there's a whole lot more people who need those more traditional management structures, and we're going to talk about why that is. So I predicted in 2014 that this was going to become a problem for Zappos. They were going to see some turnover, and guess what? I was right, because 2 years later, the company's turnover rate was like 30%. They were bleeding employees who were not responding to this management structure. And I think I've seen some more recent articles where Zappos is trying to turn this around and say, oh, no, look, our turnover rate is down. And you know what? That's probably true, because the people that they've now recruited into this company are going to be more attuned to that type of management style. That's going to be what they're looking for. Now, the problem with that type of style is that it doesn't necessarily mean you're gathering a diverse group of people. You're actually gathering a really specific niche group of people. One of the things we want to see in organizations is this diversity of thought, diversity of perspective. If you have a diverse working group, you are almost always going to come to better decisions than if you have a more niche targeted group because of the culture that you've tried to create. So, you know, jury's still out on Zappos. I'm sure they're still going to continue to be wildly successful, but this was a big problem for them. And I got to tell you, when I first saw this unbossed article, I kind of thought the same thing. I thought, is this guy doing the same thing that Zappos was? And it doesn't seem to be that way. It really seems that this unbossed thing is more of a softer style of leadership. Now, the problem that I have, or the question that I have, is what is the action orientation in this leadership style? Because again, if you go back to this LinkedIn blurb, it seems to be, servant leadership. Big fan of servant leadership. I'm very, very jealous of people who naturally have that servant leadership style, because some people, like me, have to work really hard and push outside our comfort zone to develop that style. So I'm a big fan of servant leadership, but there are also problems with servant leadership, because oftentimes the same type of people that will gravitate towards that type of leadership style, or will have that type of leadership style, one of the problems they're going to have is that they don't like having tough conversations. They really shy away from any sort of conflict. Conflict can be a good thing, conflict can be a bad thing. Conflict can be a key business driver. If we're not engaging in conflict, then that's going to end up being a problem. I think it also assumes, and part of what bothers me is this idea that if you are not a servant leader, you are automatically micromanaging your people. That just makes no sense. There is a big difference between someone who is just a normal, traditional, run-of-the-mill manager where they're the boss, they're in the power position, and a micromanager. There are worlds of shades of gray between those two things. Micromanagement is bad. Micromanagement does not produce your best results. It's not something we want to strive for. But just because you're not actively engaging consistently in the servant leadership approach does not mean that you're a micromanager. Big gap between those two things, and it's filled with all sorts of other leadership styles. And frankly, why can't we say that perhaps the best leadership style, and this is something I've actually written about for Forbes, perhaps the best leadership style is one that's adaptive to the situation, is one where you are coming in and having that consensus building at first, or you are coming in and infusing consensus building collaboration into the process, but also you're making sure that you're providing people with the structure and the systems they need in order to achieve their best result. One size will very rarely fit all. This is why for me, I'm very into thinking about different adaptation strategies when it comes to management and leadership, being able to understand what your work style is, being able to adapt that style to whatever person or situation you might find. That's going to be your key to the kingdom. It's not about going all in and going for broke and saying, I have to always be this type of leader, I have to always be that type of leader. It just doesn't work out that way. So what other things are they doing? They're encouraging 360 feedback. I generally think that 360 feedback is a good thing when it comes to really any sort of leadership. But the way that data is collected is important. 360 surveys, if you just send out a survey and ask people what their thoughts are, and you're doing it kind of like through SurveyMonkey or that sort of thing, you're tending not to get better results with those types of surveys. First off, because the leader can absolutely identify who says what, and that means that people aren't necessarily safe to really say what they think. So you always want to go to third-party systems that really protect the identity of the people giving the feedback, and also make sure to provide that feedback in a constructive way. And there's also things you can do around assessing the team as a whole rather than specifically the leader, because the team is going to be a reflection of the leader. All sorts of different options. I don't necessarily think that 360 degree feedback is bad. I do tend to think that it's not very well received. It seems that in this case, though, this guy actually had a coach helping him through it and probably helping his leadership team through it as well. So maybe she helped him with being very receptive to that feedback. And he seems to be he seems to have the personality disposition that would be much more inclined towards servant leadership anyway. I think in this specific case, and I've watched a couple of videos with this guy that I'm not going to play here, but I would not identify him as someone who has that very dominant leadership style just based on what I've seen, and it tends to be pretty hard. The dominant leadership style is actually directly opposite of the servant leadership style. They're really polar opposites. So it would be really hard for him to go from dominant to servant leadership. I bet he was already probably around there to begin with. Calling it an unbossed movement, though, that's where I maybe have trouble. This idea of being unbossed. I mean, a servant leader is still a boss. A servant leader is still in charge. And people need that direction. That's probably my biggest biggest pain point with this particular article, is that people need structure. They like to know who's in charge. They like to know what their guardrails are. It's all about really making sure that they understand the parameters and the rules in which they're working in. And sometimes one of the drawbacks of servant leadership styles is that people who do tend to have that more dominant leadership style when you put them underneath a servant leader, so you've got the servant leader as the boss, the more dominant leadership style underneath it, what tends to happen is that employee is going to be incredibly frustrated with the leader because the servant leader is not necessarily always providing them with that structure and not always letting them go after the things they want to go after, because again, they are two polar opposite work styles. But the last thing, I want to pick on the critics of the Unbossed article here too. The critics say the Unbossed movement can slow a company down due to its focus on consensus-based decision making. I'm going to pick that one apart too because I absolutely disagree with that. It is definitely true that people who have that servant leader as the driver of the company is probably going to have a slower rate of work. It's going to move at a slower pace. But that does not mean it's going to necessarily be slower over the long haul. Because here's what happens when you have leaders that do have that dominant style. They tend to move at a much faster pace. They also tend to break things along the way. So if we were to think about that dominant leadership style and maybe use the analogy of like ready, aim, fire, a servant leader might be like, ready, aim, 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 aim. Are we sure we've got the target? Are we really sure? Are we 100% sure this is where we want to go? Have we done a double check? Have we reviewed everything? Okay, now we're ready to go. Fire. That's going to be a servant leadership. And in the process of aiming and doing all that stuff, they're going to be, bringing people in, giving ideas, making iterations. It's going to take longer. What the dominant leader is going to do is go, ready, fire, aim. They're going to fire first. They're going to ask questions later. They're going to follow that gut instinct. They're not necessarily going to go after consensus. So yes, they do tend to move quicker, but they also break more things along the way and cause more problems that then the rest of the team has to come back and fix. And so ultimately, over time, are they really moving quicker? Sometimes yes, sometimes they get lucky and their gut instinct was the right decision and it was the right thing to go after. Sometimes though they're really not moving that much faster when you look at the whole scope of the process. But I wanted to just take another look, and here's another article on this guy and his unbossed leadership initiative, which I'm ragging on it a little bit just because it reminds me a little bit too much of Zappos, but generally I think that going through this type of leadership exercise is actually a good thing. He says the most powerful thing we have that can improve the world is leadership. Yeah, agree with that. The most precious resource we have is leadership. The reason society has been able to make so many extraordinary gains in the last century is leadership. I agree with that to lesser extents. I think you can't count out the individual motivation of employees as well. But I do agree with this. Leadership is not a right. It's not a rank. It's something that you earn every single day. Yes, 100% agree with that. Anyone of any rank can be a leader. Anyone can step into that leadership position. It's not about your job title. It's not about even the function of your job. Anyone in any role can be a leader. And the more that people can start to unlock that innate leadership ability, the better. In fact, maybe I would argue that, I think he just did this for the leadership team at his company, which is fine. I can't stand, I'm gonna go on a separate rant. I cannot stand that companies wait until people are in the executive level to give them this type of training. Yes, should executives have this? Yes. But what if they had this training 10, 15 years before they became executives? What if they had it when they were more junior in the workforce? I don't understand why we're reserving these types of it seems like a really good experience and really good takeaways for people at the very top. Yes, they need that. But what are you doing to cultivate the rest of your workforce? They should be getting something similar. At the very least, I hope they have some sort of leadership development program where they're bringing more people along the way with them. Let's see. The source of a power for a leader is your ability to create opportunities for people around you. I agree with that. People have to follow you because they believe in your ideas and your values. If the reason you want to do something is to please the hierarchy, you risk losing that. I think that's true for some people. I think, I agree with it and disagree with it at the same time. I do believe that the reason that people follow leaders, it's not necessarily directly linked to ideas. Oftentimes, it's because they have some sort of emotional connection with that leader, so they really like them. Maybe they're inspired by them. They probably really do like their ideas as well, but it is a lot easier to like an idea if it's coming from a person that you like. So you could think of the worst boss you've ever had. Think of, and we've all had them, think of the absolute worst boss you've ever had. What if that boss came to you and had this amazing, earth-shattering, like best idea in the history of ideas? You're gonna find a way to not like that idea, simply because you don't like the person that's presenting it. So I believe that, the source of leadership, it tends to be about people who you like, people who you get along with, people who you can maybe banter with or have good conversations with. It has to start on that emotional, trust-based level, because you could have a leader that has the best idea ever in the history of the ideas. It would be earth-shattering and making millions and millions of dollars. But if that idea is coming from someone that you do not like, then the chances of you being receptive to that idea are so minimal. You're gonna find ways to poke holes in that idea just because you don't like the person. It's not a conscious thing. I'm not saying you're being mean-spirited by it, but if you're honest with yourself, think about what would happen if the worst boss you ever had came up with the greatest idea in the history of the world. Would that immediately change your relationship with that boss? Probably not. The company's unbossing movement aims to develop servant leaders who put their team's success above their own. We've come back to this idea, and that was in the LinkedIn article as well. I do believe that it is a leader's and a manager's number one job to set their team up for success. That is absolutely true. And that's a good mentality to instill in your leaders. My question is, though, what negative attributes come along with being a servant leader? Because there is no perfect leadership style that is perfect for every situation. So in the process of creating these lovely servant leaders, are we still engaging in productive conflict with our team? Are we able to have those tough conversations? Are we able to give out critical feedback? Because sometimes critical feedback is necessary. I preach all the time about giving out significantly more positive feedback than negative feedback. I think that's very, very important. But sometimes that critical leadership is really necessary too, to keep people on track and make sure they understand what the goals are, and also to rally the team around really salient points. Listen, I one of the things I do is I assess the resiliency of teams and organizations to see how highly resilient they are, and a higher resilient team is more or less going to correlate to a high performing team. And one of the things that I see over and over and over and over again is these teams that do not agree on what the goal is. They do not agree on what direction they're going. Now, if every single person on your team is running a different race, if every single person on your team is approaching the problem with a different goal in mind, is that going to lead to a high-performing team? No, because the team has no cohesion around what the goal is. And I suspect that those teams, and actually I'm thinking about this now, and I think I might be onto something with this. A lot of those teams tend to have people who have this more servant leader approach, who let the team lead. Well, that's fine, and there's a lot of value to that. But if the team does not know the direction they're supposed to go in, that team is not set up for success. And so you have to think about the different qualities that different leadership styles bring to the experience and to the success of a team. I don't know. I guess that's really my overarching point with my criticism of this article. It's not that I think that servant leadership is bad. Again, I love servant leadership. I am very jealous of people who have that leadership style naturally. I think they're wonderful leaders. They're amazing to work for. But Are they providing the structure? Are they having those tough conversations? Are they making sure goals are clear? Are they making sure the team is cohesive? Are they engaging that productive conflict? Are they sometimes moving a little too I kind of agree with that consensus-based decision making thing, because are they moving too slowly that they're going to really alienate people on the team who have a more fast-paced work style? Lots of things to consider in this, but I think my overarching message on this point is good intent. I'm going to give the CEO, thumbs up for intent, and I think that positive intent does matter. I do question how highly resilient his leadership team is. It's something I would love to go in and assess this team and really find out. And that's something that the article doesn't really talk about. So they went through this year-long program for these leaders, and that's all fine, well, and good. What did you get out of it? How did you measure success in this case? Is it just that people are nicer leaders and their teams feel really good? I'm a big fan of people feeling good, but how did this make its way into what the team was able to achieve? Are they more productive? Are they more cohesive? Are they able to do more? One last point I'm going to make, and maybe I'll even do a separate video on this, is I was emailing back and forth with an organizational psychologist at University of Central Florida, I believe, and I have an article of his. I'm going to write an article for Forbes about it, but it's a recent study that he did and I think he did it in conjunction with some other people as well, where he found that people who have this more humble leadership style can actually be ineffective if they don't also have action orientation with their approach. So it can actually be a detrimental leadership style when you're talking about the ultimate success and productivity of the team. So maybe I'll do another video on that, but it's a really interesting article. Keep an eye on my Forbes articles, because I'm probably going to be doing a thing about it very early on in January. And yeah, that's all I have for this one. So again, 2 thumbs up for effort. I think that the devil is in the details, and I do wonder about how this was implemented, what they lost in the process. I'd love to see a conversation about what he lost in the process of this unbossing movement, because there's always balanced everything. When you bring something in, you inherently have to let go of something, and what the outcome for the team was in terms of their overall performance and productivity.